Sankofa, back to the source. Sankofa, back where our ancestors came. Back to the source. Sankofa.
Hotep, peace. Welcome to another edition of Sankofa, Lessons from Black History. My name is Baba Andar Ma'at, and I'm really honored and humbled to have this opportunity to come to you and share with you some information that I have learned that may help us all learn to grow and better understand who we are as a people. Sankofa is an African word from West Africa. It means go back and fetch it, return to the source. They have what is known as the Sankofa bird, which is an Adinkra symbol of West Africa. Symbols are very powerful because when you understand what the symbols represent, then they transmit a meaning to us that will help us to better understand the world we live in. For example, the Sankofa bird is a mythic bird. When you see the picture of the Sankofa bird, you see the bird has its feet planted solid and facing forward. The head of the bird is turned backwards, and in the mouth of the bird is an egg. Well, this is a very powerful symbol when we understand what it represents. See, the Sankofa bird is telling us that with the feet planted solid on the ground, meaning that we are living in the present, but moving toward our future, moving forward. And then you have the head of the bird turned backwards. Now, the bird is representing the idea that we must always go back, learn from our past, return to the source, meaning go back and return to the source of our past so we can learn those great lessons from history. The egg, it symbolizes the fact that we have a great future, a fertile future. So when we put it all together, this program, Sankofa, Lessons from Black History, is really about us going back into the lessons of the past, studying Black history so we can better understand our present condition, and then plot a course, plan a future as we move forward based on the lessons of the past. Well, in this edition of Sankofa, Lessons from Black History, we want to share with you what some may know, but many are not aware of, and that is this term, Ma'afa Saruta. Ma'afa Saruta is broken into two words, really. Ma'afa is a Kiswahili word. Kiswahili is an African language spoken mainly on the east coast of Africa. Well, Ma'afa means great disaster. It means great disaster. Now, Dr. Marimba Ani, who wrote the book, Let the Circles Be Unbroken, she has basically helped us to utilize this term to identify the African Holocaust. Ma'afa, the African Holocaust. Then you have the word Saruta. Saruta, this word was brought forward by one of our great scholars, Dr. Maulana Karinga, who is also the creator of Kwanzaa. Well, he brought this word from ancient Africa, from Kemet, and he says that this word translates to mean to heal, to rebuild, to repair, to restore that which has been damaged, that which has been hurt, that which has been harmed. And this is very important. So we put the words together to say we have been hurt and harmed by the Ma'afa. And we must now plot a course of Saruta, healing, rebuilding, repairing, and restoring ourselves to our traditional greatness. And in repairing ourselves, we repair all of humanity. Now, Ma'afa is actually utilized throughout America by various groups to acknowledge and to commemorate this horrific experience for African Americans. Well, in New Orleans, in June, they have a Ma'afa memorial. In September, in Brooklyn, New York, they have a Ma'afa program. In October, in San Francisco, the community hosts a Ma'afa event. In Galveston, Texas, like the Ma'afa, we have the Caravan of the Ancestors. This year, for the first time in San Antonio, we're going to be hosting the first annual Ma'afa Saruta Day. But I want to help us to understand why this is important and therefore learn Sankofa lessons from Black history. Now, all over America, 400 years are being commemorated. And those 400 years acknowledge the Ma'afa, dating from 1619 to 2019. Our goal is to memorialize, to commemorate, to remember those ancestors who lived and died in the Ma'afa. Also, to acknowledge the lingering effects, the ill effects of this horrific experience on the lives of African Americans and the human family. And then we want to create an honest dialogue to help develop a program for healing and repairing our mind, body, and spirit as a people and as a nation. I want to begin by sharing with you a quote from Miss Mary Reynolds and Harriet Tubman. See, they said, Miss Mary Reynolds, a former enslaved African, said, slavery was the worst days ever seen in the world. Harriet Tubman said, slavery is the next thing to hell. I want us to imagine just for a moment this horrible and painful experience and how that experience impacts us today. As we, as a nation, commemorate 400 years of the Ma'afa, we want to acknowledge that the first 20 Africans arrived in Jamestown, Virginia, an English colony, in 1619. But before we really go into that, I want us to understand that this was not the first time Africans had traveled to America. We had been here to America, according to the scholarship of Dr. Ivan Van Sertima. In his book, They Came Before Columbus, he documents the fact that Africans had traveled to the Western Hemisphere prior to our enslavement and being brought here to the English colonies. He talks about, highlights the fact that the natives of this continent acknowledged that Africans had been traveling and trading with them, talking about the gold-tipped spears that the Africans had. So I want to be clear, that when we talk about 1619, we're really making reference and talking about the fact that these 20 Africans who were brought here were brought to the English colonies. Initially, these Africans were identified and put in the category of indentured servants. But less than 50 years later, they had been reclassified as enslaved Africans. Now, I'm not going to go too in depth with this, but I do want to say this. There are those who have went in and tried to calculate the number of Africans who were killed during the Ma'afa, the early years. And we're talking about the late 14th century up to the 18th century. Well, some calculate the number at 5 million. Others calculate the number at 50 million, even as high as 100 million. I want us to think about that and let that sink in. We're talking about 5 million, 50 million, or 100 million. And to be honest, family, it doesn't matter if it's only 1 million or 100. It was wrong and horrific and horrible and harsh. But this loss of life was not only can be put in the category of just loss of life, but much more equally valuable was lost. Think about this. There was an event called the Zong atrocity, where when Africans were taken from the west coast of Africa, put on these vessels, these slave ships, sometime on a ship that only held 200, they would place 400 enslaved Africans. In the Zong atrocity, as the ship traveled across the Atlantic Ocean, hundreds of Africans were thrown overboard because they felt that the Africans' health was deteriorating and that they would get more from the insurance companies than they would get from the sale of enslaved Africans once they reached the shores of America. Think about that. And then think about how the fact that brought here, the families and people were broken up from their loved ones. And then you went through an experience of being renamed. So in Africa, your name was Kwame or Oba, but now you were known as Thompson or Jackson or Peterson. Family, I want us to understand that this impacted us deeply, and it still impacts us today. Because the main thing that happened beyond just the loss of life was African people were dehumanized. Black life was devalued, and we were forced to accept an idea that still haunts us today. And this idea is the idea of racism, inferiority of African people. We were made to believe that we were less than human. Sometimes you hear the term 3/5 of a human being. But when you rob a people of their name, their language, their religion, their culture, everything about them, and then you classify them as chattel, as material things to be bought and sold, you have basically robbed the people of their life. Now, if we can understand the impact of that, I want to share with you something about the present, because this is about Sankofa, lessons from Black history. We have to understand that this impacted us from the past, but I want to just share with you a few things of how that impacted us. There's a quote by Francis Grimke. He said, "Slavery is gone, but the spirit of it still remains." Dr. Janetta Cole, one of our great educators, said that the truth is that the historical and current condition of you and yours is rooted in slavery. I just want to share with you a couple of things centered around what they're sharing with us. Many of the current ills and negative conditions and cultural norms of African Americans are tied to the Ma'afa, the African Holocaust. Economic disparity. For 249 years, enslaved Africans labored and worked for no pay. We must understand that your labor is part of your wealth building. And for 249 years, Africans were not permitted to build wealth through their own labor, but were forced to share their wealth or give their wealth to someone else through their labor. And that's why today you see that African people have economic disparity, suffer from economic disparity in America. Think about during the period of enslavement, African people own less than 1% of the wealth in America. Today, in 2019, African people, African Americans, own less than 1% of the wealth in America. This economic disparity is rooted in the Ma'afa, the African Holocaust. Then you had the high incarceration rate. During slavery, Africans were imprisoned in the dungeons on the coast of Africa. They were imprisoned in the ships that transported our ancestors across the Atlantic. Africans were imprisoned on plantations. After 1865 and the end of physical slavery, they created a system of imprisonment. And today, this system has continued to evolve where African Americans are overrepresented in the prison system. African Americans are 12% of the population, but are nearly 50% of the prison population. This imprisonment is rooted in the Ma'afa, the African Holocaust. Even the idea of soul food that we have, this is part of the cuisine of African Americans, is rooted in what is known as slave food. See, slave food was brought forth because during our enslavement, Africans were fed the worst of foods. You may have heard when Brother Malcolm X talked about we ate the worst of the hog, the guts of the hog. Well, we ate the worst of the foods because that's all we was given. And today, African people, African Americans, still are suffering major health issues because of our diet that we have brought out of the Ma'afa, the African Holocaust. Now, I could go on, but I want to make this point and say that the last thing is to say the names. And this is important because during our physical enslavement, during the Ma'afa, during slavery, African Americans were called by various names. We were called from bucks to wenches to heathen to savage to the N-word. And today we are still utilizing terms like this to devalue the humanity of African Americans and African people in the world. So today we're using terms that are very similar. Dogs and predators and the N-word. But it comes out of the devalue of African life coming out of the Ma'afa. So we must understand the ills of slavery and racism from yesterday still impacts the psychological and spiritual health of African Americans today. Now, I want to share with you as we move forward into the healing, what must we do? There's a quote by the great abolitionist and freedom fighter, Frederick Douglass. He said, "Knowledge makes a man unfit to be a slave." And Dr. Malife Asante, one of our great educators, said 400 years of slavery cannot erase 4 million years of humanity and contributions to the world. Now, I want to move very quickly through this, but I want us to understand that we were not brought here as slaves. We were enslaved Africans brought here. See, enslaved Africans were brought here to America, meaning that we were builders, we were farmers, we were teachers, leaders, fathers, mothers, sons, daughters. We were people with knowledge and morals and creativity and vision. We were hardworking and life-loving humans. That's the people that were brought here, not slaves. We were enslaved and brought to America. See, the term slave robs and denies African people of their cultural identity and historical legacy. We're not born slaves. We are born Africans and humans that were enslaved. And this is very important that we make this distinction. Now, lessons from history tell us that African history and African people did not begin in slavery. And this is what Dr. Malife Asante is acknowledging. When you look at 4 million years of history compared to 400 years of history, it's like the blink of an eye. It's a short time in history. But this 400 years have had a major impact. So now we must understand that we must address this by going back and understanding the 4 million years of history. We cannot permit the Ma'afa to define our present and shape our future. We must acknowledge the ills of slavery and develop a course of healing and repair. A significant part of African American and human healing is to know the truth about the African experience. It's important that we let the healing begin. Family, we invite you to be a part of Ma'afa Saruta, to remember those who died and lost their lives in the Ma'afa, and also those who struggled to end the Ma'afa. At the same time, we must understand the ills of that experience and how it impacts us today. And finally, we must acknowledge the fact that we need a healing. And only through honest dialogue, through us sitting down and talking about some of these harsh and horrible experiences, understanding that to put them behind us, we must acknowledge that it happened and it still impacts us. Because we as a people, as African Americans, as a nation, as a world, want to be healed. And in order to do that, we must acknowledge that we are sick and we desire to work with each other to heal and restore our humanity. I want to thank you for this opportunity to joining me for Sankofa Lessons from Black History. Asante Sana. Thank you very much.
Sankofa.